and also my welcome to the COLPM Futures Conference for this year and into next year. It's wonderful to spend time with all of you here today, and I'm glad to see such a terrific turnout of friends and colleagues. Some I know well, and others I'm anxious to get to know better. We want to give a special welcome to our new inductees. Welcome to the college. It is what, for me, gives greater definition and meaning to the term collegial in our profession. I hope that you too will find terrific support and energy from the friendships and relationships you'll build here. So to that point, and to Michael's introduction, I'd like to start by thanking you all for investing your valuable time, energy, and intelligence in this conference. And then I'll follow that with a warning. We intend to take full advantage of all three of those things for this year's program. Since the conference is organized a bit differently this year, I'd like to spend my few minutes with you to explain what the Planning Committee has in store for you. I've been joined, as Michael alluded to, by a terrific group of leaders on this conference's Planning Committee. Michael asked me, Jae-Eun, Kat Moon, and Catherine McDonough to join him in planning this year's event. And we were fortunate also to be supported by Elenide Simis and Teresa Walker, who brought us all kinds of wisdom and help. And the Planning Committee was, as we all are in this college, more than ably assisted by our administrator, Debbie O'Connell. So my thanks to all of these leaders for their hard work and commitment, but most of all for their supporting of the Planning Committee's vision, because that's what this year's Future Conference is all about. It's not about a variety of interesting future-leaning practice management techniques. Instead, it's about creating and empowering others to be engaged in our shared vision for the future, a future that's inclusive, equitable, digital, connected, responsible, and accountable. We hope that by joining us for this conference, you'll allow us to harness your unique expertise and skills as legal and professional leaders and influencers, so that together we can translate our vision for the future into concrete actions and change initiatives that will drive that vision forward. We want this conference to take full advantage of what we like to call the brain trust that defines the College of Law Practice Management. So, as Michael said, we centered on three critical themes for this conference that we believe are the most important and transformational issues facing not only our profession, but society at large. DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. ESG, sustainable and responsible leadership on environmental, and for some, the E stands for employees as well, social and governance challenges. And 4IR, referring to the fourth industrial revolution presented by the movement toward digital transformation of our society. And we decided to assess and then address these critical themes by first setting a baseline of data and perspectives on these topics, collected from you through surveying and from other trusted resources. And that's what we're going to do here today in our plenary session. Then we'll break the college brain trust into smaller and highly interactive groups of about 8 to 12 people in January to address these ideas and solutions, practices and opportunities that we can offer to others to help them address these issues as well. Our topics will be introduced today in our plenary session by Jason Barnwell and by Gina Passarella. Jason and Gina will examine the data to help us better understand and then frame these challenges and opportunities that we'll ask you all to address in far greater detail on 3 successive Tuesdays in January. Each one of those Tuesdays will be devoted to one of those topics. So today's plenary session conversation is the only program of the sort that we're all used to at conferences. And after today, it's all going to be on you, the brain trust. You've been invited not to receive some knowledge at this conference. You've instead been invited to provide it. Your ideas and shared practices will help your organizations, your colleagues, and our profession address the critical themes that we all face in daily practice. So after we work on the issues in small groups in January, The college will issue a report in 2022 that captures and curates those ideas, suggested practices, and best thinking so that they can be of assistance and inspiration to others as well. So while the work starts as we set the table for our conversations today, please know that after this session, we're going to continue to communicate with you for the next several weeks until our session. We're going to enlist facilitators for the conversations. Catherine McDonough is leading that charge. I may ask for more data and will certainly provide more material from this session, like the slides and further reading. And all of us are going to ask you to help us make sure that our conversations in January are peopled by the best, the most engaged, and the most curious minds. Our registration isn't closed with the performance of today's plenary. Instead, it's just opening. We're going to ask you to think about who else should join us in our conversation rooms in January to assure that we're driving the most inclusive and valuable discussions, offering leading practices, and helpfully reporting to the profession on all that matters to them and to us. So on behalf of the Planning Committee, welcome to this year's conference. It's a conference that we hope you'll be proud to call our future as well. Thank you. I'm thrilled for us to get started today, and I am thrilled to introduce you to two people who probably need no introduction. I'm not a fan of long introductions generally, but you know, with the resume that both of these folks have, we'd be here all day if we tried to go through all of their accomplishments. So suffice it to say that Jason Barnwell is a fellow in the college. He is an attorney in Microsoft's Corporate, External, and Legal Affairs Department, which is known as CELA. He is not only the general manager for the department's digital transformation, but has had a number of roles at Microsoft that have been both technical as well as within the legal team. He's known very much as the person who is driving the future for legal, certainly from my perspective within the profession, but certainly also within Microsoft. Gina is the editor-in-chief of Global Legal Brands for ALM, American Lawyer Media, overseeing American Lawyer, Corporate Counsel, the National Law Journal, Law.com, International, Legal Tech News, and China Law and Practice. She also works very closely with Law.com Pro and GLL Advisors. She has had a long and storied career within the news media of the profession, if you will, and has been a huge influencer, not only in bringing us great information and keeping us up to date, but helping us think more deeply about the issues. And indeed, that's what I'm hoping both Jason and Gina will do today for us. So I'm going to turn it over to them to start today's program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Susan. I appreciate it. Jason, great to be here with you. As you can tell, Jason's the thinker. I'm just going to ask the questions. Jason, do you want to get us started a little bit on just kind of to go take a deeper dive into what Susan was talking about earlier as to why these three topics? What are we talking about here today in January?
Absolutely. So first of all, I got to say, when I was asked to do this initially, I was like, this sounds like work. And I was honored, but I was like, I don't know, it's a lot of work. And then Susan told me the scope of what she was thinking about, and that I get to work with Gina. I was like, all right, I'm in. And what I really take away after seeing the Innovaction Awards is that really Liz Keith should be here, but she's not. So we'll just move forward and we'll labor on. So we were asked by the college to talk about the bigger frame that explains the changes that we're seeing in our work. And why we think those are secular changes. They're not episodic. That this really is not the tide coming in and eventually it'll move out. That the sea is really rising. And so the goal today is to orient you for a series of conversations on the fourth industrial revolution, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ESG that are shaping society. And the amazing things about the college is it brings together these experts and these unbelievably high caliber minds to talk about it. And so, as Gina mentioned, we're not going to solve any of the problems today, but the goal is to level set and to get us to a common frame so that we can engage meaningfully as we move forward. And the one thing I'll start us off with is we really do need to raise our gaze as we think about how we engage these topics, because they're not the bounded subjects that we usually try to put into CLE experiences and the similar ways that we move our practice forward. These really are the water. And I don't remember if it was Gina or Susan, but at one point one of them told the joke of, there's two fish and they're swimming along, and they pass this older fish, and the older fish says, "How's the water?" And they swim along and they're like, "What's water?" And it feels like that's this, right? This really is the water that we're swimming in. And when we take a step back and we look at it, it's influencing so much of what's happening in our lives and in our work. And it's really what's causing society to rotate and evolve. So we should be expecting to see this really drive more and more work at the policy level and really at the process level as people adapt to what's coming to their shores. And if you want any proof on this, just watch the news and see how it's bending to these topics. So one of the big challenges as we wrap our minds around these things is they're hard because they're adaptive challenges. These are not technical challenges. There is no one solution because these issues live in a web of actors and challenges. And so the goal for any organization or individual is really to start understanding what the problems are and piecing them apart so that you can make meaningful change against that. And so our goal today is to really recruit you all to help walk these problems forward. And I think the last thing I would offer is these really will matter for everyone. These are going to be an increasing part of our existence, regardless of where we sit in the ecosystem. And I think Liz Keith really laid it out as to why it is a megatrend that is not going anywhere but up and nearer and sooner and harder. And so we should buckle up. So having said all of that, I think we should take a look at what you told us. So Gina, do you mind wading into some data?
Not at all. So we surveyed you, as many of you know, and thank you for your participation. And it's very difficult to see, I apologize, but just to give you a snapshot of who is filling this out. So on the higher end, the bigger numbers in the consulting and law to smaller numbers of participants when we look at individual attorneys in firms and in-house counsel. That's what we have Jason for. He'll fill us in on everything that in-house lawyers think. So just to give you a sense of where these numbers are coming from. But it's really important when we look at, okay, how do we all feel about these three big topics? And Jason, in his great computing skills, put this kind of scale together, looking at how mature are we in our current investment and understanding of it, and how much do we anticipate really diving into this in the future. And if you look here, the top metric is for the 4IR, the second line goes to DE&I, and the third line is for ESG. So the basic takeaways from this, without you having to kind of completely understand our math, is that this group of folks and their organizations are much more deeply invested currently and plan to be more invested in the future in the DE&I space, followed then by in digitization, and then thirdly with the ESG. So even when it comes to, you could think, well, okay, maybe we're just, ESG is new, we're not there yet, but we're not even at the stage yet, according to these results, where we're really ready to dive in the future. So certainly DE&I is where we're finding the most level of maturity of systems in our organizations, of investment of both dollars and times and resources. And this is just a bit of another way of looking at it. But if you think, for me, what was the most telling was, okay, here's where we are, where are we headed? That's where I always like to look. And even still, yes, we're most invested in DE&I, and we still believe that that's going to be our deepest investment in the future, followed again by 4IR and then ESG by down quite a bit amount. So Jason, would love your thoughts as to why do you think it is? I mean, I have some guesses as to why the results shook out the way they did, and that, you know, according to this group, we're doing pretty good in DE&I and really investing in the future, and the other two, maybe not quite as much.
I found these data really interesting, and there's a few kind of naive things that I take away from this. So one is that I think DEI has been around under different names, but a pretty long time as an identified problem that's supposed to be fixed with urgency, which is kind of funny that, you know, it's a problem that is urgent, but it's still been around this long. But I think it's just has a duration to it that means that people have some tractability. I also think that DEI has been increasingly seen as important as the world has gotten more multicultural faster. And you see some of the societal issues that hinge on having a more inclusive and equitable and diverse environment. I think another thing that, you know, if we're kind of just practical about this is, I think in many ways, people feel this at home, right? Like there's a texture to it because you're in the office in normal times, in the before times, you're in the world, and you have a sense of some things changing, like new faces showing up, and, you know, like the mix is changing a bit. And I guess as I kind of really try to sum that up, I can offer a cynical view and a non-cynical view. And the cynical view would sound something like this. You know, DEI is like the web. Everyone can talk about it. No one really holds us accountable for knowing too much about it. And so, you know, people are comfortable saying, like, yes, we should make this better. And I think in many instances, people walk that forward without too much concern that, oh, and somebody's going to make me do something about it. And so it tends to be very tractable. But I have a non-cynical view on this because I think about my experiences where I work, and I think about kind of what I see happening. And for us, DEI is being integrated into our talent and human resource management systems because it delivers better results in dynamic environments. Now, the thing that we hardly ever talk about is that integrating DEI into your culture and into how you work, it costs something. You really do need a stronger management core to bring together a genuinely diverse set of individuals, because bringing those people together to common cause and getting them past, you know, their challenges without leaning on direct tribal affinity, that takes more leadership capacity. But when I think about the business challenges that await us, I'm seeing our organization decide that these investments make long-term strategic sense. Because if you look at the markets that we want to move into, if you look at the customers we want to serve, if we don't have our workforce reflecting that, and if we don't have all of the perspectives that are necessary to tease apart the many challenges and problems that we have to, then we're not going to be successful. So I am not cynical about why we're seeing this move up the maturity curve. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, and I agree. I mean, you know, I think there's certainly nothing. It's great news to see that numbers in any one of these three categories are, you know, showing real investment, real excitement, frankly, about some of these initiatives. And we, on the reporting side, I mean, I hear much more about DE&I initiatives, for example, than I do about the other two pillars. But I'm starting to see, if reader interest is an early indication, a lot more focus on ESG. I hear from law firms that their clients, and I hear from the clients that I talk to, that digital transformation is at the core of what they're doing. So we know that these things are happening in the world around us. I do wonder if in the DE&I space, I mean, clearly it's a massive issue that nobody has been able to tackle. Like you said, we've been writing about this and talking about it for decades in the profession. But are folks looking at it, and maybe this is a bit cynical, as, you know, I can compartmentalize that, or I can wrap my head around it because it's hiring, or it's creating a committee, or it's, you know, making sure my pitch teams look right. Not that it's any bad intent, but that it's just in their mind the solution is more manageable. One could argue if that is the solution, whereas the other two may be viewed at this stage as just all encompassing, all-encompassing of an organization, and where do I even begin? Because I'll tell you, and we'll get to this later, some of the reasons of why we're investing or why not, that's kind of where I saw the breakdown was, oh yeah, we got this. We know what we're doing here. The other two, we don't even know where to start.
So that's really interesting. And I'm going to do my best to conjure a summary. The other two problems, so ESG and 4IR, they're these like massive, like messy systems problems, and they sprawl all over the place, and like getting your arms around those is really hard. Whereas DEI is like, oh, if I can just hire these people, I've made it better. And that's what's interesting about that is that's not how we view it in our shop, right? We really do view it as a systems approach because, so let's examine one of the things that happens at many organizations. We have created a DEI program. We are going to hire some of these, the best, the brightest, diverse talent from different backgrounds. We have created a program for that. And then the people show up and they don't like what they see and they leave. And they do not move through the organization. They don't gain more power and influence, and they don't turn it into a sustainable activity. So one of the most expensive things that I see happen all the time at many organizations is they're like, we're going to go big on diversity, but they don't think about the inclusion part. And what happens is they bring fabulous talent onto their boat, and then the talent doesn't feel welcome on the boat, and they don't contribute to the full extent of what they have available. And the enterprise suffers because these people who have often a very different perspective, they see completely different opportunities. They see different ways of solving problems. And so that's why I think I love your probing question on this, because I think you are right that there are many people who think of this as I created the program, so we're good, right? And I would argue that is a really bad investment approach, because you're going to spend effort to get those people into your organization, and then they're going to go and you're going to lose so much of the value that you work so hard to bring on. So I think you're probably right, and I think a lot of people look at it that way.
But and you made me think too, because couldn't we take lessons learned from that? I think a lot of folks, to give credit to all the great work that is being done in the DE&I space, a lot of folks are focusing now on the inclusion piece and recognize that that's so crucial. And that really is where the entire organization, top down, bottom up approach needs to come in. If we think about the fact that that's where we need to now also look at ESG, take those lessons learned and apply them to ESG, to digital transformation. It can't just be small pockets of our organizations who think about this from time to time and, yeah, that's great. Go talk with your committee and maybe we'll try a pilot program. I mean, certainly there are a lot of good iterative things happening, and these results show that there's a lot of iterative work going. I think what this conference can do, and where the industry and the world is frankly needs to head, is okay, how do we take that from iterative and beyond and really make this more of a systemic conversation? And that's a lot of what we'll get into that a little bit later, and then you all get into that certainly as we move forward. Jason, is it worth putting a on what we're talking about when we're talking about ESG, DE&I, 4IR?
I'm willing to try.
Okay, good, because I'm leaving it to you.
Okay, let's go there. So I'm going to jump. I'm actually going to.
Yeah,
all right. So. Okay, well, look, you're the cruise director. I'm Isaac, the bartender. So when I think about 4IR, and just to be real blunt, I use the term digital transformation because it just feels more convenient for me. So if I may use them interchangeably, and I will seek grace from people. When I think about what this really means for the megatrend, we should probably start imagining a world where we can have exponential growth for certain types of business, because we're going to empower a limited number of humans with awesome leverage based on machines. So if you're thinking about like what might that look like, and I realize this is going to be a little bit off-putting to some people because they're like, that doesn't apply to me. But if you look at a company like Instagram, which had like basically a handful of employees and built this crazy service that worked amazingly well and was purchased by Facebook. That's the kind of leverage that you can start creating with machines. And this creates all kinds of knock-on effects that are often hard to predict, right? Because you're basically putting this amplifier into a system, and what it does is it turns up to 11 whatever you put into it, whether that's good or not so good. And so that's one of the things that's, I think, really interesting about our profession, and why we should think about our participation in the fourth industrial revolution, not just as consumers of it, but honestly, I think we, in many instances, have a real important view on the policy angle and thinking about how this impacts society. But when I'm trying to, when I'm at hopefully a soon-to-be dinner party, because I haven't been to a real one in a really long time, and I have to talk about the fourth industrial revolution, I often start drawing on napkins, which of course puts people off, but it's okay. And I start showing exponential growth curves. And how they really start zooming up, and then I'm like, okay, so this is where the work is going, the volume of the work, and then I typically draw a pretty flat curve, and it's like, these are the resources I have to solve the problem, and so squaring the circle on that is how I think about the fourth industrial revolution. I don't know, is that too abstract?
No, I was talking to a group of young associates today, and I can tell you that they wish that they had some added help to help with that exponential growth curve, because the demand right now is crazy. But no, you're right. A group of us at ALM were at a retreat in Nashville recently, and we had an outside speaker come in and get us hyped about innovation. And I'll admit, I was a little skeptical at first when I heard we were going to have one, and I was totally bought in by a couple minutes in, and he was drawing the same hockey stick curves you're talking about, Jason. And one of the things that, and you've all probably heard of this a million times, but it just stuck with me about how when you're trying to think about disruption, and we're not even talking about disruption here, we're talking about staying ahead of the times, but trying to think about disruption, Apple was the one actively working on how to kill the iPod, right? Like they realized that things aren't going to stay the same forever, and that even if they could and be okay, maybe it's good to start thinking about new ways too. And so really taking control of the change before it takes control of you, and focusing on that, it just makes a lot of sense. It's hard to do. It takes a different way of thinking. It takes commitment to that different way of thinking. But it can be really exciting if you can get over the comfortable where I'm at kind of mentality. So anyway, my 2 cents, but would love your thoughts on DE&I or ESG. Where are you going next?
Let's go to DEI. So when I think about DEI in that kind of holistic sense, it really is about creating the right mix of people that the organization needs to deliver against the future state challenges on a sustainable basis. And that really does think about it within that full life cycle of attracting the right people, really making sure that they feel like they're meaningfully connected to the organization because they have good work to do, they have good relationships, they feel like it is a good place for them to be. And then the real measure of all of that is creating more equitable outcomes that we feel better about because they look more like the expectations we would expect to see based on who is in society and their ability to participate and contribute. And it's funny because I think many people think of DEI as a moral issue, and to be sure, it absolutely is, because it matters that we have a society that it feels fair in those ways. But I will tell you that for many of us who, when we're putting on our business hats, yes, we love the moral issue, but the fundamental driver for it really is the business imperative, because we have so much research that shows us that if you create an environment that serves the broadest group of people and gives them a place and a way to participate meaningfully, everyone benefits. And you start to get silos being broken down. You start to get the combinatorial benefits of intelligence and wisdom that happens when people feel comfortable and psychologically safe working together. So DEI, I think often has a little bit of a do-goodery aspect to it that causes some people to be like, I don't know. But at the end of the day, for a lot of businesses, it's just a competitive advantage that allows them to go out and execute against harder problems with a more effective team.
I love it. Very well said. And I know Patrick Fuller and I, who I know all of you know, I should say Patrick Fuller has been. I've been sitting home on maternity leave. He has been working very diligently to update the way that we track diversity for our diversity scorecard among the largest law firms. So, word of warning that we'll be really taking a closer look at that, really to focus too on where's the ownership, where's the equity, where is the power? Because to talk about really it making good business sense, it also has to make good business sense for the talent. The talent has to have a say, and we know in law firms, particularly, those who have a say are typically those who have ownership. So I'll just leave it there, a plug now that I have the platform to let you know that that's coming. And if you have any questions, go to Patrick. But let's go to ESG.
All right, ESG. So my simple approach to ESG is really imagine that you had to operate your business without assuming that externalities could be borne by others. It really is thinking about, okay, if I have this organization and I'm operating in a really a society, how do the decisions that I make on how I run my business impact the rest of that society? And the reason that increasingly I think we have to care about that is people are paying attention. And if you look at how policymakers are deciding how things will play out, it often does implicitly take into account what kind of impact, looking more broadly, an organization has. And so if you're looking to ensure that your business franchise has the freedom to operate and has a path forward that really is most empowering for the business that you want to run, you have to start taking into account these things that we used to say, like, well, that happens on the other side of the fence, and I don't really need to think about it. And it's really interesting to see how the investor class is starting to think about the long-term impacts of ESG. And I think you're starting to see some of the risks of some of the choices for, let's call it, low ESG intelligence being factored in and priced into enterprise valuation because they're looking at where things are going. So it's interesting because ESG I think is something that I think people have a hard time holding on to, but I suspect that many people have a pretty intuitive sense of what it means. So imagine that you're in your neighborhood and you're walking down the street and you've got your dog and your dog keeps pooping everywhere and you don't pick up the poop. Eventually, Chuck Rhodes comes along and says, like, hey man, what are you doing, right? So I think that we all kind of like struggle with it, but ESG I think actually has one of the more intuitive aspects to it that is surprisingly easy to hold on to. You're welcome for the terrible analogy.
And that's going to be my analogy forevermore. I thank you for that. That's fabulous. So this was super helpful in kind of setting the scene of what are the macro issues that we're talking about when we mention all of these three pillars. But I want to get to why this group is either investing and bullish on, or perhaps not so much on these three pillars, because I think this is really where we see, okay, at least for the legal industry, and I'd imagine many others, what's driving change or holding us back. And a lot of the things at the top, I mean, and Jason, feel free to weigh in here whenever you want, but clearly, if there's leadership and it's being pushed down and that's a priority, that is going to drive it. And lack of leadership was cited equally as being a hindrance. Clients, and we say clients, we don't just mean in-house legal departments. I mean, every single one of our stakeholder groups, and many of you said my entire business is built around advising people on how to deal with one of these three pillars and how to implement strategies. But I haven't had a client call or talk to a law firm, particularly global firms, who haven't said the three things that I am helping my clients with most right now: digital transformation and ESG and DE&I. And that's just, there isn't a business that isn't thinking of all three of these things. So that's certainly driving how other providers, many of which responded to the survey, are operating. I mean, a lot of it is what we talk about: survival, relevancy, differentiation, which I think is, a key component for many. And lessons that we learned from the pandemic. I mean, and if ever there was a time to say, okay, yeah, we're doing okay, and in many cases we're doing great right now, but gosh, didn't we learn different ways of doing things? And won't our changed footprint, because of where we're operating, demand that we look at other ESG initiatives, or demand that we do digital transformation in a more meaningful way? Then other things like you were talking about around the ESG space, in terms of why not, lack of awareness, people just not quite understanding what is happening, or feeling that, you know what, that iterative process we were talking about earlier, that's working for us, that's enough right now. And frankly, there are just too many priorities. Where do we go, particularly across these three areas? And I think this could be really something great for the college to take away after we meet and dive into each one of these three pillars individually in January. Okay, how does an organization look at them holistically and even try to tackle three such big topics systemically across the organization? Like they said, impacting too many segments of the organization. There's not enough resources or people to get around it. Anything here that stands out to you, Jason, in terms of why or why not, and what you're seeing yourself in your organization?
So the thing that jumps out at me was the one that you started off with, which is leadership. And I think one of the the benefits that I have is I work for leaders who have a pretty, I'd say, long time horizon, in as much as they think about where are we going. And what they do is they start seeing kind of, oh, that's the direction that's going, and how do I need to prepare for it? How can I influence it before we get there? And on some level, I think maybe that's a little bit of a luxury. I don't know. And that because of just the organizational structure that I exist in, and kind of like how we're capitalized and things like that, that you have the privilege of doing some of those things. And I think that part of the reason that many parts of our ecosystem struggle is people have not had to solve for that time scale, that scope in the past, because I think many organizations were just shielded from that. So if you think about that, there's like this kind of value chain that starts in one place, and it really connects sequentially through a whole series of actors. And what happens is each node like rubs up against and influences the other. I think for a long time, because of the way that many of the actors in the legal services industry kind of operated, they really were somewhat insulated from some of these. But I think that is changing, because you just can't get away with pretending like, oh, I don't need to solve for this, because it is going to influence your talent strategy. It is going to influence, who will work with you, right? Increasingly, there's going to be these accountability mechanisms that flow through the value chain that are going to make it very hard to say like, oh, we'll think about that later. And I'm not sure that the leadership that came up under the old regime is yet in the right headspace to think about how to solve these problems, how to perceive them, how to think about like what's coming. So I have this kind of wacky theory that I'm going to burden everyone with, apparently, which is, if you look at most of human history, we've operated in a fairly narrow velocity range. Like, we were either sitting or resting or walking. And then eventually we started to have machines that allowed us to move faster. But I think that biologically humans struggle to see acceleration curves. And so what happens is something starts accelerating, and it's on a curve that's bending up like this, and it's getting faster and faster. And what happens is we look at just kind of like the near velocity of it, like, oh, well, that's gotten a little faster, but it's not that big a deal. And so I think a lot of the decisions that we're making aren't looking at that second derivative. That the curve on things is really bending up and it's moving a bit faster. And I think Ron Friedman actually provided some interesting commentary on this a while back, really showing, I think the theory was, depending on where you started in this profession, your ability to perceive those changes is probably different because you saw such little change for such a long period of time that you're kind of anchored on that as the rate of change. And now I think we're hitting these inflection points, and I think a lot of leaders are either saying like, well, I don't think it's that big a problem, or the more cynical view is that maybe is not a problem that I have to solve on my horizon, and so we'll let that be the next person's problem. So I think it's really interesting.
I love that perspective, and that was so helpful. And I think it ties in a lot. We pulled a few recent comments that we've seen from in-house counsel on these subjects. And I mean, if you read through these quotes, what's clear is just this isn't, and these are clients at major corporations. This isn't something that's like we can maybe think about or maybe we'll do. It's I can't effectively do my job without thinking of these things. And the GC particularly as kind of the conscience of the company. So if you talk about the legal industry's role in this larger pillars and initiatives, but that's all coming from the board and other stakeholder groups. And that's one thing what Jason and I talk a lot about with Susan too is, like we said in the beginning, these are not hugely new concepts to the industry or to society. We've been talking about these for a long time, and that's part of the problem with why it's so hard to continue change, because it's just so easy to just roll your eyes at this, or this is what's going to change, or I clearly don't have to look at my profits. But why now? Why does it feel different now? And so I think if we spend really a lot of our remaining time talking about that. And I should note there is a questions function in this chat. Feel free to throw in questions or comments to us. Join in this conversation. As Jason and I said, we're just setting the stage. It is all of you who are going to kind of talk together and come up with the answers. But really looking at this for me, and Jason, I want your perspective. I mean, it's almost as though the last year and a half, for reasons good and bad, and oftentimes bad, humanity has kind of been unleashed. We are no longer work Gina, work Jason. I'm looking into your home and you mine right now, and we're connecting on different levels. We're aware of so much more about one another individually, about society, about different stakeholder groups, and we all have a voice and a platform to share it too, right? So all of that together, I mean, when I think about these three issues and why they're so just you can't ignore them. I mean, it's the number of stakeholders who have an opinion, have an ability to raise it, and have an impact on your business. You just can't ignore. And like you mentioned, Jason, I mean, it's talent, it's clients, it's your board, it's consumers, it's politicians and the regulatory regime globally, and figuring out that patchwork. And then it's just anybody with a platform who can have a comment and a voice and impact your day-to-day. So these are things that the world has become aware of, and they're going to then impact business, and legal has a huge, in my mind, and then I'll get off my soapbox, a huge place in this ecosystem of how to harness that and use it to benefit both your organizations and the greater good. But why do you think why now, Jason? You'll put it more eloquently than I will.
I don't know that I will, but there's a couple things that I see happening. So one is the business imperative is becoming very, very pointed, in as much as we have research that really proves out, okay, if you do this in a disciplined and consistent way, you will deliver better results. And so I will say that I work for, I think, a pretty progressive company, but I promise you, it's about value maximization. And I will say that I think we have a slightly different view on it, in as much as we really do think about stakeholders when we tell that story. And shareholders are a critical stakeholder. But we also think about the other ways that we can create value in society. And we are being held to account for that, right? So literally there are investors who show up and they're like, so you said you were going to do this. How's that going? Right? Where are you on that? And so I think that's something that's very interesting. But we're also getting it from other directions that, and I think this is where many parts of the legal ecosystem trail a little bit. Our talent base really cares. Like not in a, hey, it's nice if you, it's, look, if the organization that I'm working for doesn't reflect the values that I hold important, I'm not going to come to your shores, and I'm certainly not going to stay. And I think one thing that's interesting about the legal profession is we often catch this a little bit later because of just the way the educational and the talent cycles flow. But I suspect that many of the kind of entry points into our profession are starting to feel that in a very real way. And then what happens is the people who start taking on this mindset, they graduate themselves into really roles of power and influence within organizations that steer these larger organizations, and then that reinforces itself. And so that's a virtuous cycle that we should expect to see is going to accelerate, wherein there is a reconciliation of the physics that drive fundamental value, but then also the key inputs that help the organization drive that value, aka talent. And when we're talking about really information-based work, and then when you layer in on top of all that, that there are these people called regulators who it's their job to start thinking about value maximization as a public good at a larger frame. They start really, and they wield the power of the sovereign. So they show up and they're like, yeah, you just need to do this. And they're getting the same tools and capabilities that other organizations are. And so their ability to hold organizations accountable, to really examine like what's happening, that is starting to really change. So if you have any doubt about these things, again, I would say go look at the news, right? So there was a large technology organization that recently had someone who used to work on the inside that shared a bunch of documents about kind of how they were thinking about things. And that's increasingly, let's ignore the kind of the information leakage risk on that, but examine that we might see more of those kinds of traits and behaviors from the people who are coming into our talent SKUs. And so if we're not thinking about how we really honor their preferences, the people who have these great talents, and we start tracking our behaviors to the expectations of this larger group of stakeholders, there will be problems. And so I think that goes back to exactly what you're talking about. Like if you're a modern GC, that's all the stuff you're having to kind of worry about and think about and help make better. And man, that's hard. So I'm glad I'm just a middle manager.
I'm glad I just write about this stuff and I don't have to figure it out. Well, let's talk about it, because so what's next? What do we do with all this? And we want to make sure too that we recognize that there are organizations of all different sizes and types. And I think that was reflected in the data that we received from the survey. Some people just said, I'm an organization of one. This doesn't apply to me, or we can only impact this one pillar on when it comes to hiring, and we only hire so much. We don't do a lot of turnover, things like that. So really thinking about, okay, what does this mean? How do I as an individual and as an organization need to care? Can I get involved? Is there any room for me in this conversation? And taking that forward to January, because I mean, you hinted at this, Jason, that we could just stand still and frankly, like who are we to preach to anybody about what you have to or don't have to do as a business? I think what excites me about this college and hearing Susan and Michael particularly as you were explaining kind of the three reasons why this college exists. I mean, it's to really be the leaders of the profession and help drive the profession forward, help see what is coming down the pike, and make it happen, or work together to find ways that we can have a voice and can have influence in a good way. Jeff made a really good point in the chat that leaders are proactive, only reactive when necessary. Value is always in the eye of the customer. Delivering value is a function of effectiveness, efficiency, and customer experience. And I would add to that, I think it's not just the customer and the client anymore. There are, talent has always been a stakeholder group. Of course, it's one of the biggest assets most organizations in this college have, but it's more now than ever. I mean, we just have to be thinking about, or at least you don't have to be thinking about it. You can operate as you will, and your stakeholder groups will react as they will. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to know who are the stakeholder groups for each of our organizations, and how do we need to react accordingly, and go from there. But Jason, your thoughts on just, as we think about January and what we could really spend time doing and getting out of this as a collective, what would you focus on?
I think I would start with the realization that we all have a platform. Everybody. Now, some of us enjoy the privilege of platforms that have amplification capabilities. So, for example, if you're the editor of a gigantic media outlet, you have a wonderful platform to amplify things. But we all, through the business relationships we have, the social relationships we have, the work we do, we have the ability to influence the thinking of other people, right? Because when you go to someone who trusts you, because you have earned the right to offer them something of value because you've done so in the past, you have the ability to bring them a gift of knowledge, of insight, of something they can do that leaves them better off than when you found them. And I think that's the kind of mentality that I always try to walk forward with when I am engaging with the college, which is the people who come to these events and the people who bring the best of what they have, they bring us gifts of insight that we can then take forward. And like, being super selfish, what I do, so I took, I went to the conference a couple years ago, and I shamelessly hoovered up all the slides, and I looked through them, and I took them back to where I work, and I started showing people things. I'm like, hey, I saw this, and like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And then people were like, wow, and they thought I was smart. And they answered, no, I'm not smart. I just borrowed somebody else's stuff and imported it. Like, hey, did you know this is happening? This is wild. And so I think that is something that's available to all of us if we're just thoughtful about, how do I take this piece of information, this insight, this wisdom, and I walk it forward in a form that's easy for somebody else to digest and do something useful with it. And if I offered nothing else, I would say, as we engage these topics and we have the real experts show up and like pull them apart and show us how they work and make us smarter, realize it's this amazing opportunity to effectively borrow these super genius brains and then go talk to other people and look blindingly smart. Like, oh my gosh, I know something that's like really wild. And so I think there is something that's in it for all of us. And that's why I think engagement going forward makes a lot of sense from a purely personal and selfish reason. So that may not have been the question you were asking, Gina, but for whatever reason, that's what came to mind.
No, I love it. And I love the passion. And it's why I'm so thankful to the organizers for this. Because I mean, if I were going to put together a conference, I don't know that I would have been as thought-provoking and forward-looking as these folks were. I mean, to think about these three massive issues that are impacting society. And Susan, I would love it if you joined us back, because you just said something on our chat that I think is so perfect for exactly what we're trying to do here. And it's that lawyers have an outsized opportunity to lead across industries, issues, and systems. So we shouldn't just be thinking about how this affects us, but how lawyers can affect it. And I think if what better, and I'm sorry if I stole your thunder and inviting you back in, but it's so smart, and it's exactly what we all should take away from this. I just learned from Jason. He told me what to do, and I stole your smartness and took it on. But it's exactly what we can think about. We want you to leave here today thinking of, wow, these are really important society impacting decisions that we can have a say in and get a head start on, depending on how we look at it, and really drive change. And so, Susan, I want to thank you and your planning team for putting us on this path.
Well, I certainly thank you. I think that the whole concept here of focusing on systemic kinds of issues, because these are so knotted together and so complex and so interwoven, that ocean that we're all swimming in, I guess I would just conclude by reminding everybody that while we're talking about systems, when we're talking about these issues, when we talk about change and leadership, lawyers and the legal profession and the professionals who work within this college are those systems, right? We are the human equivalent of the systems in terms of how we are able to connect all of those who are in positions to have an impact, to create change, to think about new ways of doing things, to look at those longer term impacts, to look at how the curve will rise up exponentially. And if we're sitting on our island waiting to see how other people do this so that we can follow, not only have we missed an opportunity, we've missed our obligation as a group of people who've been specially gifted